Good afternoon, all. This is Pam Gothard with Social Studies School Service. We are delighted to have you joining us today. And we are very fortunate to have Heather McKenzie joining us today. If you've gotten to tune into one of Heather's sessions before, she is absolutely phenomenal. I know you're going to love it. And I don't want to eat up any of her time. So, Heather, I'm going to just turn it right on over to you. And thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share something I'm so excited about with teachers who may be joining us live or perhaps watching this later. So welcome to our session, Critical Thinking is Critical, so think critically. As Pam shared, my name is Heather McKenzie, and I have the honor of serving as an instructional coordinator for a very large school district and also serve as the virtual specialist for 8th grade for the state of Georgia. If you have any questions at any point throughout this or you think about it later, you're welcome to raise your hand if you're joining us live. But if you're watching this later, I wanted to share my Twitter handle, which is at HESMAC18, and feel free to tweet me or send a direct message to any questions that you may have, any follow-up, or any way that I can support you. So with that, if you are joining us live, then let's make this collaborative. And the way that you can do that, if you're not familiar with the functionality of GoToMeeting, is that at any point you can look in your upper right hand corner and unmute yourself to directly ask a question, or you can raise your hand or type something into the text box and Pam will let me know that you are there. So let's begin with a quick warm-up. I want to share a tale of two lessons. So picture a classroom where students are learning about the establishment of the United States as a country with its own government. Students are asked to identify our earliest leaders and provide the accomplishment for which they are best known. Versus a lesson in which learning about the establishment of the United States as a country with its own government, students are asked to determine the major issues of our earliest leaders were confronted with and how it may have affected their leadership. The criteria that we're essentially going to be evaluating these two lessons on is level of knowledge needed, level of investigation afforded to students in these two activities, and whether or not students are required to provide any type of judgment or evaluation. So if we look at the left-hand column here, where in which students were asked to provide the accomplishment for which the leaders are best known, there's a degree of knowledge that goes along with this. So obviously you're looking at chronological knowledge, you're looking at some working knowledge of when did this take place, contextualization, and who were our earliest leaders, and then also what were their accomplishments. If this is not something that they know immediately, then that's going to take them into the investigation range. But with what we're asking, it's not necessarily asking the students, I would think, to provide judgment or evaluation. However, if you look over to the right, also a degree of knowledge, the same as the lesson on the left, also a degree of investigation, the lesson on the left. But the major difference that I notice here is that students are asked to make some degree of judgment or evaluation, because the students, while identifying major issues that the earliest leaders were confronted with and how it may have affected their leadership, we can probably find some piece of text or some instructional piece, something of that nature that may blatantly tell students. But here, they're going to have to make the determination of, well, they faced all these issues. How may it have affected their leadership? And notice it's very difficult to say, yes, that is definitively right or that is definitively wrong. I mean, unless they were addressing something that we just know chronologically is completely off base. So here's a situation in which you could see that both of these lessons essentially started out the same way. I would be willing to go so far as to say we're probably addressing the exact same standard. But what the student product looks like and what the demand on the student's cognition is, you can see here is different. And so I wanted to do that as a warm-up because when I was preparing for today's webinar, I felt a lot like Oprah giving away cars. I wanted to share all the things. You get a strategy, you get a strategy, you get a strategy. I just entitled to increase critical thinking for your students. But then I realized that the aim is not to unintentionally overwhelm, but rather share some immediate takeaways and strategies, which brings us to our focus for today, which is that we are going to ask, what does it mean to think critically? How do we know? And what does it look like? And so in our time together, we should have the answers to these questions. Our plan for today's session is to look at critical thinking, what it means to make thinking visible, and what could all of this look like. Our learning targets that we will revisit later are I can explain why critical thinking is a higher order thinking skill, and I can identify instructional strategies that will increase critical thinking in my classroom. So let's get going. While critical thinking may seem like a broad or at times term, here we have explored that a little bit first. Order thinking, the way that I would very simply state it is that it goes beyond anything that you do with a basic observation or memorization. The moment you do anything in terms of applying your knowledge, I think that you are moving into the realm of higher order thinking. And so I don't think that any of us would disagree that our goal as educators is to provide opportunities where students grow to be evaluative, grow to be creative, and grow to be innovative. If you take a look at this image in the bottom left-hand portion of your screen, then you can see some of the elements that are a part of higher order thinking. And this idea of critical evaluation, I think, connects very closely to critical thinking. So if you do a simple Google search, then it's going to yield one definition. So according to dictionary on Google, critical thinking is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment, whatever that means. So while referencing scholarly research, however, you're going to find a lot more. So according to these experts in the field, here is what we know. If you take a look at the first, it references critical thinking, allowing us to think about our own thoughts and our own reasons behind our points of view. So I see that these authors are providing support to indicate that critical thinking provides a lot of reflection or justification. If you move to the second bullet, this seems to align a little bit more to our very simplistic definition of higher order thinking, which is going beyond memorization work and activity. So we're working for understanding as opposed to just working to get something done. And finally, we look at NCSS. And so for me, because I love social studies and we are sharing a session for social studies school services, I am of the belief that all of you love social studies as well. So NCSS is a great touchstone for me for what does quality social studies instruction look like. And so NCSS shares that critical thinking skills demonstrate the ability to reflect on content in order to form a solid judgment based on both evidence and common sense. And I love the inclusion of that because I think that there is so much to be said for being informed and not simply opinionated. But I think that our desire to seek out that justification comes from something that we care about. So it's skill based. We look at the content, we form judgment. So going back to that evaluation and judgment piece from our warm up, and then we base it on evidence, also with common sense. And so as educators, we are very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, for example. And so it's no surprise that we aim to promote teaching that essentially moves students through the progression of learning. We want to transition students from a lower level of thinking to higher level of thinking, from knowledge to comprehension, where students are understanding and confirming what they're learning. But then we want to take that comprehension and ask the students to apply or use that information. And once they're able to do that, we want them to dissect it, take it apart, which is often referred to as analysis. When students fully take something apart and really understand it, then they can make an evaluative judgment. And then once they do that, they can put these pieces together in some degree of synthesis. And as you move up that scale, students are having the opportunity to build those skills. These skills can and will build with opportunity and practice. So you are doing more to support critical thinking. And why is critical thinking important in teaching? Well, because according to Paul and Elder, much of our thinking, left to itself, is biased, distorted, partial, uninformed, or downright prejudice. Yet the quality of our life and that which we produce, make, or build depends precisely on the quality of our thought. So therefore, this idea of critical thinking and providing opportunities in which students can craft their ability to think critically is a foundation of a strong education. And that's what we're going to explore a little bit more. Now, I do understand that there are often roadblocks to critical thinking. And so what I was able to find as I was looking for materials, that these were some commonalities that authors shared. Too many facts, too little conceptualizing, too much memorization, too little thinking. Lecture, rote memorization does not require critical thinking. These three things, when I have conversations with the teachers in my district, particularly those that are in areas that are assessed by a state standardized test, they feel very strongly that they are pigeonholed into this position because of that. However, I would argue that as we train students to think and think critically, all of those other skills are going to fall into place, because critical thinking is more than just simple engagement. And so let's pause here to take a moment to check in by playing a little game of evidence of critical thinking, thumbs up or thumbs down. So if you have joined me live, then I'm going to ask you to chime in. And if not, then Pam, I'm going to ask you to play around with us. And so if we look at this first statement, students that ask questions, not simply answer them, would we say that that is or is not evidence of critical thinking? Okay, so I'm going to say that that is evidence of critical thinking. If we look at assessments, items that require recall alone, well, let's think back to what we learned about the definition of critical thinking. Critical thinking is doing something with our learning and moving beyond memorization, which is another word for recall. So we're going to say that assessment items that require recall alone are not evidence of critical thinking. However, opportunities for students to identify real-world issues that relate to content is critical thinking. And then back to our friend memorization, please memorize all the state capitals, is not necessarily critical thinking. Now, that is not to say that there is not a place for recall for that base knowledge, but our aim is to work beyond that. So it's clear from that activity that we understand that active learning is critical thinking. Now let's apply this to the knowledge in social studies classes, which say that critical thinking is doing social studies. So what does that mean? Well, like you, I read a lot that is educational related, whether it is a part of a book study, for work, or simply by choice. And so one of the texts that I consulted when I was preparing for this session was this book by Ron, I hope that I pronounce his name correctly, Richard and Mark Church and Karen Morrison, and it's called Making Thinking Visible: How to Promote Engagement, Understanding, and Independence for All Learners. And those three words are words that I absolutely love when referencing any type of learning, but specifically social studies learning. And so among lots of other information gathered, the authors essentially say that learning is a consequence of thinking. So students' understanding of content and even their memory for content increases when they think through and with the concepts and information that they are studying. So overall, what visible learning tells us is that skills and abilities alone are not enough, that we need to have an alertness to situations for thinking. Um, and that the research is supporting that children, and sadly some adults, they struggle to think deeply. And so really good thinking is going to involve abilities, attitudes, and alertness, and visible thinking is designed to foster all three. And so they share 5 thinking routines in one of their chapters, and these 5 really spoke to me. So when we think about questioning, it's the level of questioning that's going to encourage thinking and push beyond recall, while facilitating and clarifying. A good example of that is, well, what makes you say that? And so it's asking the students to reflect on their own thinking and provide justification. No surprise that listening was incredibly important, and that developing active listeners is going to provide a space for reflection and discourse that is essential to critical thinking. Modeling an interest in ideas is also another thinking routine. So even as a teacher, when we ask questions that we don't necessarily know the answer to simply to open up discussion, then you're modeling your own interest in ideas and the desire to learn more. And then finally, constructing understanding. So asking questions and providing space for connections to be made, either within the content, among other contents, to real world, what have you. And so that is what they recommend. And so if we've outlined 5 thinking routines, then I'd like to begin with a strategy that I believe clearly addresses the first 3: questioning, facilitating and clarifying thinking, and listening. And so I am a huge fan and proponent of these 3 questions. Now, for those of you who may be joining us that are K-8 and perhaps teach math, or if you are a former math teacher, you may recognize some of this language from the Math 3-Act tasks. But it's 3 simple questions. What do you see or notice? What do you know or think you know? And what do you wonder or are you curious about? And so I say looks like ... because I've seen this work effectively at every level, even as early as kindergarten, because it is the start of inquiry. So let's try this out together. So here is an image. Many of you have seen this before, and it is from, I've taken this from the U.S. National Archives. And so is there anyone joining us live who would like to just share, what do you see? Okay, so we're going to pretend that I am thinking aloud, and this is a really good teaching opportunity because there have been plenty of times when I've stood in front of a classroom full of students or even adults and have engaged them in this, and maybe they're not yet comfortable sharing out or they're unsure. And so I think aloud and I model what that behavior is. And so what I see is I see an image and I see that it is in black and white. I see what appears to be machinery. And I think that it is machinery because I see this pulley system here and I see different parts. I see hardwood floors and I see children. And I believe that they are children because they seem small in comparison to these machines. I see what looks to be 2 little boys. I don't know that it is, but I believe I think that that is what I see because of the clothing that they are wearing. So what do I know or think I know? Well, I know that this image must be old because I know that we now have colored photographs. I also think that this image must be very old based on the clothing that they are wearing. Um, and I think that this is old and dated because of the laws that we have in place now. You should not see children in a factory, especially, and I don't believe that it's a field trip because this child does not have shoes on. So what I wonder is, where are they? I wonder when specifically this was taken. I wonder where it was taken. I wonder why the children are operating these machines because it appears dangerous. I wonder why this child is not wearing shoes and this one is. I wonder who took that photograph and why they took that photograph. What was the reasoning behind choosing to do that? And so I'm going to stop there just for the purposes of time. But what I hope you're getting the impression of is that imagine doing this in front of a class of 20 something students. You can see how this can continue over and over again. And as students would say, I see blank or I think blank, then as a facilitator, I would say to the students, well, what do you see that leads you to believe that? Why do you think that? What evidence do you have to support that those are in fact children? And so if we break this process down, then you'll know that did I at any point, if I am the teacher, tell the students who was in the image? Did I tell them when it was taken? Did I tell them why it was important? And did I tell them whether or not their thinking was incorrect? Absolutely not. Now, that is not to say that all of those answers would not come in time. At some point, all needs to be revealed as part of a greater inquiry-based lesson. But what happened instead during that experience was the teacher facilitating and thinking out loud and thinking with and listening to the students and simply asking clarifying questions. And so this is further evidence that a critical mind is a questioning mind. So if we go back to focusing solely on the questions, and we think back to Bloom's, then we know that our aim at the most basic level is to move our students from knowledge to understanding. And so with questions, one of the easiest way to do that is to move away from closed-ended single answer questions to open-ended questions, such as the what do you see or notice? What do you know or think you know? And what do you wonder? And so thinking is driven by questions. So one of the other strategies that we're going to address in a minute, for example, is an instructor using the Socratic approach is not looking for a specific correct answer, but is in fact inspiring students to reflect on their own thinking. So going back to open end, not there not being a single answer, opportunities of reflection, you can think back to how these tied into some of those definitions or information about critical thinking. So Socrates respected the experiences, understandings, and knowledge that individuals had gained through life experiences and believed that through questioning, previously attained knowledge could be used to develop thinking supported by rationales and logic. Going back to the NCSS definition of evidence and common sense. And so back to our thinking routines, I want to look at a strategy now that I think incorporates all 5 of these. It hits all the high points, and that is Socratic questioning. So here are some Socratic questioning strategies. If you are familiar with this, then you know what an incredible opportunity this is for students. Most think that this is exclusive to AP, advanced placement, or IB courses, or even at the secondary level. But I would venture to say that that is false, and that when you are guided by Socratic questioning strategies, that there are opportunities at multiple levels, elementary and secondary, to help students think through their learning. And so there are a number of resources out there to support, but here are 6 types of Socratic questions that I found to be common among a lot of the research. So opportunities to question clarity, questioning precision, questioning accuracy, questioning relevance, and questioning depth. And so things like thinking is only relevant to the extent that supporting arguments have been examined and applied. So now we're going to play with a little bit of Socratic seminar. And so if we open up to the question, what is history? And I chose this because I felt like this will provide the opportunity to incorporate a lot of those questioning strategies, but this is somewhat agnostic to any specific discipline. So whether you are teaching, middle grades, modern global studies, whether you are teaching 5th grade, whether you are teaching AP world history. This idea of world history, or excuse me, of what is history, is something that can get started. So imagine that I posed this question to a group of students and I said, what is history? And the students said, a student started us off by saying, it's a study of the past. So as a facilitator, what I would do to employ these Socratic questioning skills is I might say, well, why do you say that? And then that student or another student, but ideally that student would say, well, because most of what we are learning in history are about events that took place long ago. And then I could say, well, what would be an example of that? And call in a student to give an example. And so a student can provide an example of that. Or if I didn't say that, I could say, well, what's an alternative definition? What's something else that we could say? What's another way to explain that? What generalizations can you make? Do you have a counter argument? What is the point of this question? And so again, going back to open-ended, not necessarily a right or a wrong, but think about the learning that is occurring through that process. Think about students having to reflect, to recall, to evaluate, to justify, to make judgments. So going back to that image that we looked at before. And here's the bottom line, that's just good learning. Students, when they come in, they want to learn, but they want to have fun and they want to be engaged. And the moment that you have an opportunity to challenge them and ask them to think deeply, then that content is going to stick with them and it's going to become a part of their schema and they're going to continue to build and grow on that. And so with that, we are rapidly approaching the end of our time together. So I wanted to take a moment to recap. And so we began with a plan to define critical thinking. And so essentially what we learned is we learned that critical thinking is encompassing of the idea of applying content, of understanding our own thinking and our own biases and the things that we bring to our learning and understanding. We talked about making thinking visible through some of the visible thinking strategies. So those included questioning, those included facilitating clarifying questions, listening, and there are many more. I just chose to focus on those 5 for the purposes of today's session. And then we talked about looks like. And so the 2 takeaways that I hope that you have and could potentially employ as early as tomorrow, if you felt so inclined, are this idea of our 3 questions of what do you see or notice? What do you know or think you know? And what do you wonder or are you curious about? And those are well used and well received when you are integrating primary sources or images, political cartoons, whatever your standards call for. And then also the idea of Socratic questioning, because in addition to the questioning, what you are also teaching is collaboration and discourse and teaching students how to effectively disagree and build on top of one another's points and arguments. And so with that, I want to take us to a final check-in. And we're going to do thumbs up and thumbs down again, only this time I want us to look at some examples of instruction that supports critical thinking, thumbs up or thumbs down. And so the first strategy is something that I call classify and categorize. And this is actually one of my favorite things to do with students, where I will provide them with lists of names or events or dates of significance events, and I list them all and then give them to the students and say, I want you to break these out into various classifications and then title your classification and then be prepared to explain why you chunked things out the way that you did and what is your reasoning and justification behind that. Why did you give it that title? How does your thinking differ from somebody else's? So would we say that that is instruction that supports critical thinking? The ayes have it. So yes, that is instruction that supports critical thinking. Definite thumbs up. And then we've got rote worksheets. And I know that I have used them in the past. I know that they are still popular at times and sometimes have their place in instruction. But for our purposes, would we say that that is instruction that supports critical thinking? Probably not. However, something like students participating in the Model UN or mock trial or junior youth assembly or National History Day or a social studies fair or something of that nature is absolutely evidence of instruction that supports critical thinking. And then just for funsies, we go back to the please memorize all of our state capitals, which while useful, should you land on Jeopardy, is not going to be instruction that supports critical thinking in any real way that we want. And so with that, we come to the end, and I want to open it now for an opportunity for any questions that you may have, any way that I can answer it. And for those of you who may be viewing this at a later time, this is a great time to pull out those phones and send me a message or tweet me if you've got any questions that you need. But for anybody in our audience, are there any questions that I may answer? Thank you so much. Like I said, I really enjoyed the opportunity, and it is something that I feel, sort of passionately about. I just want to close by kind of sharing with everybody, just kind of a quick challenge that I would pose to all of you because it was something that was once given to me. When we write lesson plans or unit plans or anything of that nature, it's very common for us to write down that an objective or an outline or a goal is that students will think critically. And so what I would ask you or I would challenge you to do that is that look back at your instruction, your lesson, your student product, whatever that is, and highlight or circle exactly where the students showed evidence of thinking critically or where you provided an opportunity to think critically. And I say that because many years ago, I was one of those teachers who wrote plenty of lesson plans for public consumption in which I would list that as an objective. And I had an incredible mentor who handed back a unit plan to me once with a red pen. And she said, I want you to circle everywhere that the students are thinking critically. And I struggled to do that. And that was what forced me to do my homework and understand that this is just beyond education ease or throwing out a buzzword that is important, but that it's really going back to examining my own teaching and what that can look like. And so I loved the opportunity to share that. I hope for those of you, and I know you're doing great things in your classroom, tweet it out and tag me. I would love to see what you're doing. And thank you all so much.
Thanks again, Heather.